Look, I think it's another necessary U-turn, and I think the Chancellor, she had to make that change. I mean, she obviously looked like this has been a very difficult period for her to go through. I'm not convinced that these changes will save her politically ultimately, but this was the kind of last roll of the dice, I guess.
And last roll of the dice, how long, given what's happening in the markets, as we just heard from Lucy there, given the reaction from Conservative MPs, I'll come on to a bit of that in a minute, how long does she have to roll that dice before the game is up?
Well, so I think you're right to say that we need to think about the markets and we need to think about the politics. So in terms of the markets, it's perhaps difficult to disentangle what's the reaction to her speech and what's the reaction to the fact that the Bank of England are withdrawing their support this afternoon. So we'll have to see how that plays out. In terms of the politics, where I'm probably better qualified to comment, the constraint is that Conservative MPs are worried that it looks ridiculous to have another leadership election and another 3 months of a zombie government. So the question is whether or not they can align around somebody and have a coronation in a very quick transition, I guess.
And is that
whether they're prepared to give the Prime Minister a bit of time to see if she can shift the polls. But there's no question that if the polls stay where they are at the moment, she's not going to lead the party into the next election.
Well, that seems like an understatement, though. I mean, a lot of people are talking about she's got days rather than weeks. Is that possible that she could be gone within days, do you think?
It's definitely possible that these things can move very quickly once colleagues come to a strong collective view. So we'll have to see how it plays out over the weekend. She herself, I thought, looked shattered by events, and I think on a human level, whether or not you agree with her, and I obviously take a very different view from her on policy and what she's done, but it's difficult not to feel a certain sympathy. Politics can be brutal sometimes, and she's learned the hard way that if the markets don't believe that you have credibility and your own side don't support what you're doing, you've got very few places to go at that point.
Well, it's interesting to hear your take on that because, of course, you worked with Theresa May in the last days of her premiership. She had a torrid time with her party. She looked haunted at times. Take us into what might be going on behind those famous black doors in Number 10 now? What might be going on in Liz Truss's head from what you know from a sort of Prime Minister at the end of her tether?
So I think people very rarely give up voluntarily. I mean, Theresa ultimately accepted that once Theresa got to the point that she couldn't see any way of getting her Brexit deal through, that was the point at which she accepted the game was up, and actually the right thing to do in the public interest was to stand down. But people politicians have worked their whole lives to get into this position, so they're not going to easily just give up because they're under a huge amount of public pressure. And you've seen today, basically this policy was her policy and the Chancellor's policy, but she's been prepared to ditch a close friend and an ideological ally in an attempt to try and reset her government.
Obviously we were talking about Theresa May. It has been suggested that she could be a potential sort of caretaker Prime Minister. Is that remotely feasible?
I suppose it's possible. I think it's probably unlikely. I think it's more likely that you would go to a senior member of the existing government in these circumstances.
Jeremy Hunt?
Jeremy Hunt is obviously now a possibility. He's in a very strong, as Lucy was just saying, it's very difficult to see how the Prime Minister could lose another Chancellor. So Jeremy is in a very strong position now. I guess the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, might be another person that would command fairly broad support across the party.
This idea of a Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt dream ticket, you less convinced by that idea?
It's possible. The parliamentary party, I think, will be petrified at putting the country through another 3 months of a leadership election. So if they want to change, they've got to find some combination that the vast majority of MPs are prepared to get behind. And I guess the difficulty you've got, bluntly, is Rishi was the first choice of the MPs in the last leadership election, but there's a significant chunk of MPs who are Johnson supporters who wouldn't want to see him inherit the crown. And therefore, how do you come up with a configuration that nearly everybody can get behind and therefore avoid the country being subjected to another 3 months of a zombie government and all the ridicule that will be poured on the party if it tries to do that?
But do you not think that Nadine Dorries, the former Culture Secretary, has a point in this reported WhatsApp message group? She said, we may as well embrace dictatorship because it's the most undemocratic proposal imaginable. To install another Prime Minister, and let's not forget, the country has not had a chance to vote on Liz Truss as Prime Minister. It isn't democratic, is it?
Well, I mean, I would observe that virtually, I think a majority of the prime ministers in my lifetime have come into office not by winning an election, but by their party changing leadership. That's how James Callaghan became prime minister. It's how John Major became prime minister initially. It's how Gordon Brown became prime minister. It's how Theresa took over.
And the Tories put Gordon Brown under immense pressure to hold a general election. Do you think a general election now really is the only way out of this mess?
I think a general election is very unlikely because it's not in the Conservative Party's interest.
Yeah, but it might be in the country's interest.
But it might well be, and I can well understand journalists and lots of people saying we want a general election.
Well, ordinary citizens.
You asked me whether you thought it was likely or not, and I don't think it's likely because in order for it to happen, you'd have to get a majority of MPs in favour of it. And it seems very unlikely that Conservative MPs are going to do that.
Actually, Gavin, I did not ask you if it was likely. I said, is it the only way out of this mess?
It's not the only way out. It's not the only way out, is it? Because they can, and look, I think if you change the leadership, but the broad policy platform is still very similar to what you stood on in the manifesto, then that is a more defensible position. One of the reasons the Truss government has got into difficulty is there was a very, very sharp change of policy from Johnson to Truss. I actually would argue to Cathy that there was probably a bigger change in economic policy, Johnson to Truss, than if Keir Starmer had taken over as Prime Minister.
Wow, that's quite something.
Such a departure from the manifesto that the argument that no one voted for this is very powerful. If the party now goes back to something that is much more similar to the manifesto that everybody stood on in 2019, then the reality, as you know, is that people don't vote for it. It's not a presidential system. So there would be a more defensible position if the policy platform is closer to what people voted for when we had the election in 2019.